The ABS measures what they call innovation active businesses. It's defined in something called the Oslo Manual, and it is defined as the implementation of a new or significantly improved ... a good or service, marketing method, organisational method, or operational process. And 48% of all Australian businesses that employ at least one worker met that definition in 2015-16. It's relatively high by international standards, but it is surprising. Every time that we've looked closely at this data in previous iterations of the Innovation System Report, how it always correlates positively with measures of business performance. And my hunch is that it's actually pointing to something that's kind of, it's not about innovation per se, it's something innate about the businesses themselves. So those businesses are just more likely to be better run and are more likely to be innovative, and then that's what's showing up in terms of the correlation with performance. In any given year, you can identify at least 10,000 businesses in Australia out of the roughly 120,000 that have 5 or more employees that qualify as high growth. And that means, because there's actually quite a lot of them, they're found across all industries. We're not talking about digital startups. Of course, those ones are in there, but they're actually found across all sectors of the economy. They're found across all age groups and all size bands. The half-life of high growth firms is not very long. Once they've satisfied that criteria of 20% year-on-year growth for 3 years, year 4, half of them are no longer high growth. Year 5, 2/3 of them are no longer high growth. Year 6, 3/4 of them are no longer high growth. So you can see that downward trajectory there. If you were pre the global financial crisis, in almost all years prior to that, except when we were having recessions, Australia's GDP has a 3-point-something number. Sometimes it has a 4-point-something number. It usually has a 3-point-something number. Since 2008, it's been 2-point-something for every year except one. And this year it's 2.8%, the numbers that came out earlier in the week. So we haven't hit that 3% mark consistently since the global financial crisis. And that correlates with a decline in the incidence of high growth firms in the economy. And we don't know which way the causality runs. So we don't know whether, if the macroeconomy is performing strongly, does it create the conditions under which more high growth firms come into being? Or is the economy not performing as well as it was doing before the global financial crisis because there are fewer high growth firms than there were before then? We've also done some work on research and development. And we've also categorised classified firms as high growth according to how much they're spending on R&D, and if that's growing at 20% a year for 3 years or more. And what we show here is which industries are the most prominent there. It does often surprise people that manufacturing is the most R&D intensive of all Australian industries, but you can see it's declining there as a share. I think this is a worrying trend for Australia. So the Bureau of Statistics estimates that there's been a 12% fall in real terms, and as a share of GDP, business expenditure on R&D peaked in 2007 and 8 and has been declining pretty sharply ever since. And if we think about the conditions for growth in a 21st century economy, you don't really want your R&D expenditure to be going backwards. The more businesses spend on R&D, they get a positive return on average. Their turnover rises, but they get much greater returns if they're high growth firms spending more on R&D than if they're slow growth firms spending more on R&D. Roughly 13 times if they're at the 90th percentile relative to the median. That's why you get that S-curve. So for the high growth firms that are investing in R&D, they're getting huge returns from it. So have tried to look in a kind of very precise, statistically causal way at the association between innovation and high growth firms. Here what we've done is we've integrated the data from the Business Characteristics Survey into BLADE. So the Business Characteristics Survey is where we identify the innovation activities of businesses, and then we measure how that relates to growth. And so what we're trying to do here is to say, if you control for all of the other factors that might be associated with growth that we can observe, we don't observe all of them, but the ones that we do observe, What is the additional contribution that innovation makes to business growth? Businesses that invest in goods and services innovation grow faster than businesses that don't, irrespective of whether they're a high growth firm or not, but the high growth firm gets a bigger return. That's the one kind of key finding that comes out of that. The other one that we've done is we've said businesses that have a strategic focus on innovation outgrow businesses that don't, after you control for all these other factors, by 10% in the subsequent year. This is very seductive for governments to go, hey, there's these businesses that outperform their weight by at least 5 times in aggregate. How do we get more of them? And we've said, well, they're actually pretty hard to identify. Let's see where Data 61 get to. And the half-life is pretty short. I do think there's an issue. I was talking separately with Paul earlier. There's some separate work which we've done this year on mid-sized businesses. And we've done some work using Blade, which shows that amongst middle-sized businesses, they are 10 times more likely to shrink back to being a small business than they are to grow to being a large business. And I think there is an agenda around how do we identify these mid-sized businesses and help them to scale up and not to shrink. We've always had an argument about it's not a good idea for government to pick winners when it comes to industry. Is it a good idea for government to pick winners when it comes to individual firms? And you probably want to be paying attention more to what we call the framework conditions, to your IP law, to your venture capital funds, your access to finance, to competition policy as the underlying conditions which are likely to encourage all businesses to reach their growth potential.